We will indeed hear from our sponsor before we get started. So why don't we introduce the panel first, and then we will introduce our sponsor for some opening remarks. We have today Attorney Diane Wallace Booker, who is the Chief Officer for the U.S. Dream Academy, Dr. Jamie Calazar, Senior Pastor of the City Temple Seventh Adventist Church in Dallas, Texas, Dr. Marissa Leslie, who serves as System Medical Director of Psychiatry Healthcare and Assistant Professor of Clinical Psychiatry for Georgetown University School of Medicine. We have Dr. Marilyn Link, Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Adventist Healthcare. And finally, Dr. Zach Ritter, Associate Dean of Students at Cal State Dominguez Hills, actually one of my alma maters. We are going to have opening remarks by Ann Rhoda from the Adventist Healthcare, and I'm going to turn it over to her at this time.
Thank you very much. My apologies, everybody. Thank you very much for your patience. As we begin this session, join me please in prayer. Thank you. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for this beautiful Sabbath day that you have given us. We thank you for the opportunity to gather together as a community, to learn and to grow. Father, through the voices of the speakers and the presenters today, may we hear your call to action for each one of us, to respond, to care, to do what needs to be done, to create the kind of community that you intended, a community where all are included, where all are accepted, and where all are valued. Father, we also ask for the courage to respond, because sometimes we do hear the call to respond and we are afraid. So give us courage and boldness, God, knowing that when you call us to do, you are with us, you will strengthen us, you will give us the words to say. So we ask for your presence now as we begin, and may we be transformed by our experience today. In your name, amen. So I am Ann Rhoda. I serve as the Vice President of Mission, Integration, and Spiritual Care for Adventist Healthcare, which is a health system that is in the Mid-Atlantic region. And on behalf of our President and CEO, Terry Ford, our leadership team, and the over 6,000 employees and physicians, I send you greetings and well wishes. And we are so excited to be part of this convention and honored to sponsor the Lucille Byard Symposium. Lucille Byard is part of the Adventist healthcare story. And while her story sheds light on a painful and unfortunate part of our history, her story also has strengthened our resolve and commitment to justice, equity, and inclusion. At Adventist Healthcare, we believe that every human being, no matter their condition, gender identity, race, age, nationality, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, or their faith tradition, every human being will receive equitable health care and be treated with respect to uphold their dignity. We commit to acting with integrity and holding ourselves to the highest standards of speech and conduct. I share that statement with you today, not because we're trying to be proud or we're trying to show that we support this movement. I share this statement to you today for accountability, to be held accountable and responsible to what we truly believe and how we want our organization to be. And so, to honor and remember Lucy, we have commissioned the artist by name of Simi Knox to paint a formal portrait of Lucy that will hang in a visible and very public place in the lobby of the White Oak Medical Center. Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with Simi Knox, he has painted the portraits of many individuals in the highest level of government, such as Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, the Honorable John Conyers, the Honorable Eric Holder, and Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Simi Knox also painted the official White House portraits of former President Bill Clinton and former First Lady Hillary Clinton, and those paintings are hanging in the White House right now. So we are so blessed to be able to find an artist who we know will represent the story and the legacy of Lucille Byard. Furthermore, Adventist Healthcare is excited to announce that we have established the Lucille Byard Scholarship to provide educational opportunities to bring light to health disparity and inequity amongst people of color. Adventist Healthcare is committing $100,000 a year for the next 5 years into this scholarship to grow it into a sizable and sustainable endowment that will enable students the opportunity to realize their educational dreams. Now, the initial focus of the scholarship will be to help nursing students in their nursing education who, without this support, would be unable to complete their studies. Preference will be given to nursing students of color. Furthermore, we are developing an outreach campaign to the nursing schools of Oakwood University, Howard University, and Washington Adventist University. The Lucille Byard Scholarship application will be opening this December and will also be available at the Adventist Healthcare website. Now, we are currently planning an event that will include the unveiling of the Lucille Byard portrait and the official launch of the scholarship, and that will be happening before the end of the year. And while the continued COVID pandemic will impact our ability to hold large gatherings, we are planning to live stream this event so we all can be part in honoring Lucy's continued story. Thank you again for the opportunity to be part of this amazing convention and to experience, to learn, and to grow together. With that, I will now turn this over to Dr. Marissa Leslie to begin the Lucille Byard Symposium. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne, for that introduction.
That was a wonderful set of remarks, wouldn't you say? Just before the panel begins to share their knowledge with us, we will have special music by Madison Mission, No Greater Love.
I'm wondering how many people can think of the last time they told God they love him just because he's God. For some, it may be yesterday, maybe this morning. For some, it may have been last month. Whatever it is, let's get on one accord this morning and let God know I'm loving you, God, not because of what you can do, not even because I need you to bless me for what I'm praying for, but I just want you to know I trust you and I believe you and I'm loving on you just because you're God. Can we lift that up to him this morning? I love you, Jesus.
I love you, Jesus.
Come on, we're just loving on him a little bit. I worship
and adore you.
And right now, I just want to
tell you
that I love you.
Lord, I love you
more than the car, more than the house.
anything.
I love you for all that you are, God. Let's say it again. I love you, Jesus.
I love you, Jesus.
Lift it up. I worship and adore you.
I worship and adore
in the comfort of your home, just let them know.
Just want to tell you,
Lord, I love
Lord,
you
I love you
more than
more
anything.
than anything.
Woo. Come on, somebody else, let's lift it up to him. Pick a part and let's just sing, I love you.
I love you, Jesus.
Man, if you think about it, you might lose yourself in worship to him. Because the things that we have, we know we definitely don't deserve. So we just tell him today, I love you more than anything. Come on, let's lift this up to him just because he's been so good to us. Say it again. I love you.
I love you, Jesus.
I worship and adore you.
I worship and adore you.
You've been so good, God. Just want to
tell you,
Lord, I love you.
Lord, I love you
More than anything. Come on, just sit in it for a second and think about what God has done for you. Think about who he is. Think about what he's covered. Huh? Your sins, he's not written them out for anybody to read them in the sand. But he's just here for you, and he lets you know, hey, in spite of all of that, I still love you. Come on, let's sing it to him right here. This is my favorite part.
Jesus went
Because of what he did on Calvary's cross. Huh?
to save
We no longer have to worry about being lost. But we have a right and a chance at eternal life. Come on, lift it up to him. Let's lift it up in one voice here. They hung him high. They stretched him wide. And he did it willingly. Songwriter said he never said a mumbling word. There's no love like the love that Jesus has for us, huh? That's love. Come on, let's say it to him again. Pick up our, let's hung him high. They stretched him wide. He hung his head. For you and me, he died. I get excited when I think about these kind of things because I know I don't deserve it. I'm excited about this part of the story too. That's not how.
The story
In 3 days' time, he got up with all power. Huh? That's the God that we have to call on. That's the God that's on our side. Come on, let's say it again. Invert your part here. But that's not how the story is. In 3 days' time, he rose with. That's a love. That's a love that holds on to us. That's a love that embraces us. There's no greater love. Searched all over, still can't find nobody. Nobody that can do it like our God. No greater. He deserves all the glory. He deserves all the honor. Bless your name, Jesus. Come on, lift up your hands right where you are and just love on him for a little bit longer. Lord, we thank you for being good to us. Thank you for not treating us how we deserve. Come on, say, just want to tell you.
Just want to tell you,
Lord, I love
Lord,
you.
I love you
Thank you, God.
more than
Thank you, God, for not treating me how I deserve, but loving me in spite of myself. Anybody's testimony? Bless your name, Jesus.
That was such a beautiful song. So let's start this really important topic. As Pastor Doggett introduced, I'm Dr. Marissa Leslie. I'm a board certified child and adolescent psychiatrist as well as an adult psychiatrist, and it is my honor to facilitate today's panel. So as a physician, I'm trained to not just identify symptoms. Can you imagine what would happen if you went to your doctor and we only focused on your headache instead of trying to understand, is your headache because of a muscle issue, because you have something in your brain? Or what about depression? What if we just focused on, well, here's a pill for your depression instead of trying to understand what's at the root of it? And similar to chest pain, what if we just focused on, well, here, take this pill for your chest pain, instead of understanding, is it muscle soreness or is it a heart attack? Not identifying the roots of things can be disastrous. So this is why we are blessed and honored today to have this esteemed panel to examine the roots of racism instead of just the symptoms. And we'll learn more about the hidden wounds that result from systemic racism. So I'm going to start with Dr. Link. Dr. Link, can you talk to us about what systemic racism is and give us some examples?
Sure. Thank you, Marissa. I'm honored as well to be here serving on this panel, and I want to thank the Conscience and Justice Council and Adventist Healthcare for today's symposium. So I'd like to start out with just talking about what is a system? These are a set of things that together make a whole. It's an established way of doing something. So we are regularly going about doing whatever we want to do because it's the normal way of doing things. It's how we get things done. And systems tend to run by themselves, right? So there's no initiative by any one person or any group. And racism itself is a system. So racism is social and institutional power plus race prejudice. So it's both a system of advantage based on race and a system based on race. So it's different than our racial prejudice or hatred or discrimination because it involves one group that has the power to carry out systemic racism or discrimination through these major institutional structures in our society. So systemic racism is sometimes called structural or institutional racism and manifestation of racism in our society. There are these racialized patterns in our policies, practices, and they permeate throughout these structures, political, economic, social, cultural structures, and they generate differences in the well-being between people who are white and people who are not white. So here are some examples. There are 4 levels of racism. Internalized, which is our own private, and some our comments or saying, promoting someone, we may say, you're not a cultural fit for my organization. Then there's interpersonal racism, which is more about how our private beliefs will affect our interactions with other people. And those usually are expressed in public expressions of hate or bias or microaggression. Then there's institutional racism, which is bias in our organizational policies or practices that result in inequity. So you'll recognize those things in the criminal justice system, education, housing, healthcare. And one example that has been really well established is in housing, the example of redlining, right? So specifically used by banks and in the real estate industry for a long time, where they literally outlined in red the neighborhoods where people of color lived. And if you were inside those red lines, loans were considered risky. People were not investing in those areas. And so that, of course, leads to a cumulative effect where people are not getting own property. And then finally, there's structural racism. And so there's a system of these biases that go across our institutions and our society that, as I said, cause these cumulative effects. Higher rates of poverty, higher rates of unemployment, arrest, and disease or death. So we saw this in the COVID-19 pandemic, right? The rate of COVID-19 deaths were much higher among communities of color. By saying there's a way of thinking about systemic racism. So if anybody's been to the airport, or in a building where there's an escalator or a moving walkway, you know what that's like. You can get on the walkway, you can stand still and it'll move you along, or you can walk on it and get to where you want to go a little faster. And then sometimes there's the occasional person that will turn around and try to walk in the opposite direction. Usually they're little people. And Dr. Beverly Tatum talks about this. She's president emerita of Spelman College and the author of the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting in the cafeteria. And she looks at the ongoing cycle of racism like that moving walk. Racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the moving walkway. It is moving with the system. If you're passive and it's passive racist behavior, you're just standing still, but you're still going in the same direction, moving along on the walkway. There's no real overt effort that's being made, but you're continuing to move forward along with any of the bystanders in that same direction as those who are actively walking forward. But then there are going to be people who are going to walk in the opposite direction. And unless you're walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed that's faster than the moving walkway, then you have to, and you're being actively anti-racist, then you're going to find yourself being carried along with others. So that's a way of thinking about the system of racism.
Mm-hmm. So Dr. Link, something you said is intriguing me. And I hear people often say, I'm not racist. Why do I have to be held accountable or called out? I'm not a racist person. And you mentioned anti-racism. So what is anti-racism?
Well, we're not born racist. And we're not born, we're not born anti-racist. It's really about a choice. And being anti-racist is a choice to fight against racism, right? It's an action. So we actively do something, we actively say something, but it goes against the status quo. Again, if we choose not to do something, then that's that passive behavior that I mentioned earlier. And that way we're upholding the status quo and these unequal systems, as I mentioned, of I took my team at work to the National Museum of African American History and Culture, and it was the third time that I was there, and it doesn't cease to awe me. All history, all the culture, but even the hidden and not so hidden wounds of racism. Again, throughout our that's something that's happening, outside of where I socialize or where I worship. But really, the stories that we tell ourselves. Who are our neighbors? Who do we interact with on, Sabbath morning or a Sunday morning? It's about it being the most segregated hour on the week. Be thinking about looking internally, at our own system.
Thank you, Dr. Link. Dr. Ritter, I'd like to bring you into the conversation. You do some really fascinating work, particularly as it relates to anti-racism. And so when we think about some of the hidden wounds of systemic racism, expound on the work you do and some of the hidden wounds that result from systemic racism.
Well, thank you so much for having me today. I really appreciate being here. I try to work with some of my Cal State Dominguez Hills and someone's alma mater right here to work through racial battle fatigue, imposter syndrome, anxiety, depression, suicidality that comes from a system that is racist, sexist, and classist. And so we have a food program, we have mental health services. And so when we think about systemic racism, it's not just theoretical. This is actually causing college students to drop out, to kill themselves, to be depressed. So many, terrible things that we don't want to have happen in our society. I want to say something about anti-racism and your second part of the question. I'm thinking about my father this morning, who was born in 1947 in Germany, in a refugee camp. And his parents were in Auschwitz, in different concentration camps. There was a system of systemic racism in Europe, not only towards Jews, but towards Romani folks, towards Black folks, towards, a bunch socialists, a bunch of different people. And his parents lived in post-Nazi Germany for 3 years. And they said, we don't want to live here anymore because it's corrosive to us. And what kind of future is going to be for our child in this systemic racist place? But one would think, well, the war is over, right? The systemic racism is gone. But, Ibram X. Kendi and Robin DiAngelo teach us that systemic racism is a cultural thing, but it's also a policy thing. So maybe, some of the stuff that Hitler learned from us is off the books. And what am I talking about? I'm referring to Caste, Isabel Wilkerson's book, Caste, where she clearly points out to us that the Hitler regime learned its systemic racism from us, right? Number one, the concentration camp system was borrowed uglily from the Native American concentration camp system in this country, right? And this is true. Hitler studied our stuff and took our racist and genocidal past and made it present. Number two, he studied our Jim Crow laws in the South and said, and there was issues of Jim Crow in the North too, so let's not get it twisted. But Jim Crow in the South and said, black folks and white folks need to be separate, blah, 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 unless we subjugate people, and he took that and said, well, this is great. Let's do that in Germany with Jewish folks and Romani folks and other undesirable groups that were on the bottom of this pyramid of systemic racism. So I just want that to be known that this is not just an American thing. This is throughout the world. So what can you do about it? All right. One of the things is being honest about history and how we tell history. Dr. Link, who was just speaking, was talking about how we talk about these issues of history and redlining. The GI Bill was great for a lot of folks in our country, but the policy was racist because you could get housing and you can get free college after the GI Bill, remember, after World War II, but that was not true for black folks. You couldn't go to the white colleges because they wouldn't accept you. You couldn't go to the white neighborhoods because they wouldn't accept you, and on the housing covenant, the policy said no Mexican folks, black folks, or Jewish folks, right? And my grandfather was turned away because he was Jewish in certain neighborhoods with redlining. So I know what you're thinking. I'm a good person. I'm sitting in this audience. I want to do the right thing. Again, Robin DiAngelo and Ibram X. Kendi would say, great. Now, what are you doing culture-wise and what are you doing policy-wise to make it anti-racist? Make what anti-racist? Your household, your workplace, your block? Well, I don't have power to change the policy in my workplace. Okay, well, how can you change some of the culture in your workplace? You could talk to folks. You can get a black and brown organizational group. But what would Malcolm X say? If you're a white person, organize the white folks, right? They might listen to you. Organize white folks and try to change culture slowly and get them to think about history and their practices every day to change. And more so, how do you change policy at a workplace or an environment to make it anti-racist? You have to look at it and think about what we think is normal. It's equal, it's normal. This is a neutral law. Neutrality always benefits the dominant group. So look at every policy that you have at your place, and this is just normal. This is how we do it for 20 years. It's probably benefiting white, cis, hetero men more than other folks. And we can change these things. This isn't a session to make you depressed and sad and upset about the world. You can change it. You have the power to do so. And hopefully we'll get into more stuff about what you can do. You can even open up your wallet and look at who you're supporting in terms of your financial stuff. I just went to a rally against Chase Bank because they were supporting detention centers in California. And I know the Haitian immigrant issue is in the news right now because they're getting whipped by white, looks like cowboys from the 1800s. look in your wallet and see who you are financially supporting in terms of your credit card and so on and so forth, because they may be supporting very, very racist, sexist, classist things that you don't agree with. So you have to take yourself out of that situation and don't support these systemic racist institutions. And Dr. Link says, you have to be that person that turns around at the airport and starts walking the other way. It's not easy. You might lose friends, you might lose a job, but at the end of the day, it'll make you whole. And that is that's what the Lord will want you to do, right? We heard that beautiful song, and that's walking with Jesus. So these are our decisions that we have to make in life.
Thank you, Dr. Ritter. I do feel more empowered after hearing you speak. Could you just briefly, but I will say, you briefly mentioned imposter syndrome, and without presuming to know what every audience member's experience is, I'm going to guess, because I know I've experienced this. No matter how hard you work as a person of color, as a woman of color, get all these credentials, all these degrees, we still encounter that hidden feeling of, do I really belong here? Do I really belong in my medical school class? I know I felt that, Do I really belong at my Ivy League institution? Do I really belong in church leadership? Am I just clamoring to work for God without being acknowledged and just being appeased? Talk to us a little bit about imposter syndrome and how that can really tear away at the psyche.
And here's a place where I want to be a bit anti-racist myself, and maybe I can model it for my white brothers and sisters and folks beyond the binary. I have imposter syndrome all day, every day, but not necessarily because of my race. So I want to popcorn that real quick to someone on the panel to just give a second about what it was like for you, in terms of imposter syndrome or racial battle fatigue in your experience.
Dr. Colasar, Pastor Colasar, think you could take that?
Yeah, wow. It's a heavy question, but I appreciate Dr. Ritter's commentary and Marilyn Link's commentary. Yeah, so fatigue, right? I think about when Eric Garner was murdered by the police. Prior to his death, he said, "I'm tired." He said, "I'm tired of you all." He said, "I'm tired of you all harassing me." And then they proceeded to strangle him. And I captured that embodied or express the feelings that Black people have with police and systemic racism. So one of the things that I do when I can talk to my church about white supremacy is that the goal of white supremacy is to make you tired. That's it. It's to make you tired, to make you give up, and to just let things be as they are. So fatigue is something that me personally, I live with, right? And not just fatigue on things that are happening to me, but fatigue by just turning on the news and seeing cowboys from the 1800s whipping Black people, right? Whipping Haitian immigrants. I mean, what kind of world are we living in? And so those sorts of images, those sorts of continual images of seeing Black people shot, immigrants detained at the border, it has a mental breakdown on you that makes you tired and say, there is no way we can win this fight. As Dr. Link was talking about systemic racism, every time you chip away at a piece of it, it feels like they add something else. As we can see in Texas, where I am, we have Jim Crow in a tuxedo, right? So we've dressed up Jim Crow where we're taking away voting rights. We've dressed up Jim Crow where we're taking away critical race theory. And it's just like when we get one victory, it takes like we feel like we take 5 steps back. So the answer to the fatigue, I really don't have it, just to keep on pressing on and to keep trying our best to work along and across the aisles, because we know that there's power in numbers and when we're all on one accord.
So much, Pastor Colasar. So eloquently said. And can't wait to get to Diane. I'm going to get to you. And before I do, I will give you my personal experience with my hidden wounds. You know, like I mentioned, I was raised to be twice as good. I'm a proud Haitian American, born in America. My family, half of my family is Haitian, and Dr. Link's heritage is also Haitian. And our ethos is you have to be twice as good to get half the respect. And you know, I would say I've worked really hard, not just to be a good Black, so to speak, but because I strive. You know, my family's instilled in me, and yet and still, I can tell you this working year, sit in a meeting and be called the name of the other Black woman in the room. It makes you feel invisible. It makes you feel like all this work you've done, it doesn't matter what degree you have, you're just another person of color. So when I talk about hidden wounds, that's what resonates true with me, to me. Diane, we've heard some talk about incarceration, and we when we talk about symptoms, we can say, oh, look at the incarceration rate of the Black community, but that's just a symptom. You do some very impactful work with the children and communities of incarcerated individuals, and you've been doing that for many years. Talk to us about that work, and talk about some of the hidden wounds you've seen in the children you work with.
Sure. Thank you. This conversation's so good. I'm really learning so much from each of you. Let me tell you a little bit about the work that we've done over the past 23 years at the U.S. Dream Academy. We serve young people from families and communities that have been disproportionately impacted by incarceration. These young people live in very under-resourced communities, which expose them to risk factors like we're talking about poverty, family stress, academic challenges. While the exact number is unknown, there are about 2.7 million children in America at any given time with a parent incarcerated, and over 7 million that have experienced it at some point in their childhood. That's about 7% of all kids. What we know from studies, from our own experiences, is that the Black community has borne the brunt of violent policing and racially disparate laws, leading to higher rates of incarceration. And as a result, nearly 1 in 9 Black children have experienced parental incarceration in America. This is compared to 1 in 57 white children who've had a parent incarcerated and 1 in 28 Hispanic kids. When you compound this disparity with other historical inequities, some which have been mentioned here today, we talked about redlining, how we fund schools. These other practices have led to high poverty areas across the US that are disproportionately Black and brown communities. We often refer to them as inner city communities. We see them on the news a lot when they're talking about crime and violence. Over time, the families in these communities have suffered from trauma, lack of access to true wealth building opportunities, even when they are buying properties in their own communities, because their properties have been undervalued. There have been a lack of investment by elected officials in these communities. There is daily unfair treatment that they are experiencing with the police. Under-resourced schools. And our programs, our U.S. Dream Academy programs, which are after-school and mentoring programs, are located inside of what we call Title I public schools. And they're Title I because they have 30% or more of their population are kids who are living in poverty. The schools that we're in are 99% kids in poverty, and they are 100% Black kids. So we've got these concentrated pockets of poverty all over the country. And then you layer into this the criminal justice system, which, as we know, and we don't even have time to kind of go into the layers of racially disparate laws that are integrated into the criminal justice system. But it has resulted in the height of mass incarceration, which is around 2008, there were 2.4 million people in prison, and 59% of them were Black and brown. 40% were Black people, mainly men, another 19% were Hispanic. Black people make up 13% of the population, and we were making up 40% of those who were incarcerated. And it is not because we are committing more crimes or we're committing more violent crimes. It is because we are over policed. And when we are arrested, we are overcharged. Many of us is sitting in prison today, can't get out on bail. We haven't even been convicted of a crime, but we cannot afford the bail. And sentences for Black men and women are typically longer. A parent arrested and in prison for 10, 15, 20 years of their lives is enough to crumble the hopes and dreams of a young person. What we tend to see in our communities that where we're working in, and we are around the country in communities that have really been devastated, particularly by two factors, or three: poverty, crime, and low performing schools. And, I think Dr. Leslie mentioned it, I'm not sure if you mentioned it or not, I'll mention it again. This analogy that we hear a lot, right? If you're walking past a lake and you see one fish floating at the top of this lake, you say, oh, what happened to that fish? What happened to that? Was he born? Did he have something wrong? Did he eat something bad? What happened to that fish? If you walk past that same lake and you see 100 fish floating at the top of it, you were saying, whoa, what's happening in that lake? What's happening in the water to cause those fish to die? But we often don't do that when we walk past high crime communities where the young people there are failing in schools. Many of the schools that we're in, 60% of the kids in those schools cannot read on grade level. But we don't turn around and say, whoa, what's happening with that school system? We often, for many years, until more recently, have said, what's wrong with those kids? And they were typically poor Black kids. And so then what happens is that when we focus on the oppressed and the failings and deficiencies of the oppressed, there becomes this layer of shame that we as oppressed people carry around. I can remember and I grew up in Loma Linda, California. It's an incredibly safe community, sort of white Adventist. I've always felt very safe there. But when Roots came out, and this, first came out talking about slavery, the next day in school, kids were on the playground talking about, oh, slave, you be my slave. Come over here and be my slave. And I felt ashamed that my ancestors were slaves. And I tried to run away and not, and I was the one ashamed, right? Not thinking that these white kids calling other people slaves should be the ones. So I was carrying around this sense of shame. And what a lot of our young people carry around is this sense of shame about their own conditions. So one of the things I want to add in, there are three unseen wounds, but I'm only going to focus in on one because of time. But the three unseen wounds that we see a lot with our kids is stereotyping. This is the one I want to talk about. Low expectations and safety. And in stereotyping is really a tool of the oppressor to deeply ingrain within our psyche the way in which white is better, white is superior, it's desired, it's wanted, it's safer. And one of the stereotypes that has so impacted young Black people is this idea that Black people are more violent, that we don't feel pain in the same way, that we are built for prison. And you can see studies and judges who are honest about it have talked about sentencing Black people longer because they believe they can handle it, and white folks less. You could have seen in the transcripts where they've said with a white young man, oh, he's not going to be able to handle prison. And they gave him community service or something. They also, the stereotype that Black kids don't have the same level of emotion or love and that they're abusive. Black young boys, I think, are the most misunderstood people in this country. And I'll give you one quick example. One of our young people, his name was Marcus. He was in the 6th grade when he self-enrolled him into the program. He's in Baltimore City. And this kid was a hothead. I mean, the drop of a dime, he was angry, right? If you looked at him wrong, he was always angry and popping off. But he comes to our program, and after about a year of working with us and our staff and mentors and all the things that we do to develop relationships with young people, he became like our star student. His grades improved. His temper was greatly reduced. He still had his moments. His help and support of all the kids in the program. So we're talking to him one day. We're like, Marcus, you know what happened? What was happening with you a year ago? And he told us that every day when he would walk to school and he would see the abandoned houses, and he knew who the drug dealers were, there were gang corners he had to avoid, and he would walk there and he would be afraid, not necessarily of them, although there was that. He was only in the 6th grade. He was afraid that this is what his life would become, and he didn't know how to make that any different. And he showed up angry at school because of the fear he had inside about what he would have to do to survive in this community. And once he came to the Dream Academy and he had some opportunities and he saw that, oh, my life could be different. Oh, I do have a little bit more control over my life. Oh, yes, people see me as violent and dangerous. And he already knew that because people were always kind of like, they were afraid of him because he was a really tall kid in this class. And they didn't treat him with respect and care. And what we recognized very clearly was that we often are afraid of the kids that we say why they always get their pants hanging down low and what we're afraid of them, but we're not stopping to ask these young people, what are you afraid of? And how do we come into a community and build relationships and rebuild trust and help break down the stereotypical views of how we often see young people, because those views dictate how we treat them. And when they're treated with fear, they respond back with fear. And so that's stereotyping. And for Black folk too, we sometimes are afraid of our own people, and we participate sometimes in our own oppression unknowingly. And so we've got to unravel a lot of these stereotypical views that are deeply ingrained in our psyche and that absolutely impact how we treat Black folk and how even resources that go into communities, they don't come there because oftentimes we quite frankly don't care as much about Black communities as we do other communities. And a lot of that is for these layered reasons for how we think about Black folks. And so low expectations, we've talked about a lot in schools. We see that, low expectations. And then of course, safety. Many Black kids growing up in poor Black communities do not have a sense of safety growing up. And that sense and that stress that comes along with that causes lots of other health conditions and of course mental health concerns. And so those three together are three I think that we as a community and as a church need to recognize and even find ways to address unpacking some of those issues and how we come and show up in communities recognizing these unseen wounds.
Absolutely. What are you afraid of? First of all, if we were in a church, I'd be standing up and running around the sanctuary because this is really resonating with me. It's so important, and it's not limited to the children you work with, but also, of course, their caregivers, their grandparents, their parents, the aunties. Everyone is affected. So we're going to close this out with Dr. Ritter, Pastor Colasar. I'm going to give you kind of a tag team question and topic before we take some questions from the audience. So Dr. Ritter, I'm not asking you to speak for white people. Let me just be clear about this, okay? But I do want to hear your thoughts on why the dominant culture, and in America, if anyone's watching from outside of the US, in America, it does happen to be the white European descent culture. Why is the dominant culture so resistant to the concept of systemic racism? That's the first part. Second part goes to Dr. Colasar. And we've talked about this, Pastor Colasar. We've said this is not the responsibility of the oppressed to solve. So, what advice do you have for our sister congregations in how they can take action to be anti-racist? Because, like you said, we're tired. We're tired. So, Dr. Ritter, your thoughts on why the resistance?
What am I going to have to give up? I mean, you've all laid out, a really strong argument, and it sounds like I'm the bad guy, right? This is the type of thinking, right? So I was born white. I didn't have a choice. I'm trying to be a good person out here. I don't want to hear that there's all these bad things happening. The appropriate person of faith response, I feel, what can I do? I'm so sorry this is happening. What can I do as a white person in this racist, sexist, classist society? And really listen, right? Really listen to folks of color, to trans folks, to everyone, to poor white folks, even that are being oppressed by this system. Okay, so real quick, even me as a white Jewish guy, there's hierarchies within the white community, right? I mean, we used to call them WASP folks, but like more Anglo-Saxon white folks don't look at me as them. I'm lower on the food chain in terms of a system within that system. So there's complexities within the complexities. I lived out in the Inland Empire, and I was often looked at as the outsider guy. So there's complexities even within the white world. Okay, but I want to say two examples and hand it over. Jesus was pointing out systemic racism in the ancient world, right? He said, render unto Caesar's what's Caesar's, and render unto God what's God's. And he's pointing at the coin, right? Some emperor made this coin. That's a social construct to create a hierarchical society where people get stuff and there's slaves in Rome and this and that and that. But God's land and God's people are God's people, right? They know how to love each other and care for each other. But we've created these systems that oppress each other. And so, yes, there's different interpretations of Jesus, but Jesus was saying there is corruption, immorality, and moral decay, and as Martin Luther King would say, moral bankruptcy in the Roman Empire. There is systemic racism, classism, sexism in the Roman Empire, and we need to change it. Now, he didn't see it in his lifetime, right? They killed him, right? The forces of the empire killed this messenger, but eventually the empire adopted, right, with Constantine, Christianity. And so it's interesting when you plant a seed that the system is rotten, things actually might change over time. And, Tupac would say, I'm just the messenger here. I'm talking about how dirty the streets are, and maybe someone's going to come clean it up. Okay. My other example, and then I'll hand it over. Germany, again, with Nazi Germany, right? They were so shamed by the international community. They were forced to pay reparations to my grandmother, $300 per month. Black folks never got any reparations in this country. Native folks never got any reparations in this country. We never had to deal with our ghosts and our moral decay. We've tried over this decades, but when you teach honest history and you change how things are in a society like they did in Germany, it results in 1 million Syrian refugees being accepted into Germany. That's what we call a cultural change and a policy change over 60, 70 years in the country. How many refugees did we take from Afghanistan? How many refugees are we allowing to stay from Haiti? We're putting them back on a plane and saying, sorry, we're not the place. Don't give us you're tired, you're hungry, and you're nationless. We don't want that anymore. So we haven't done the work to deal with it because Again, dominant groups, what am I going to have to give up? How much money do you want? I struggle too every day. There's a sense of denial and entitlement and individuality that we need to break through in this country, and it's going to take a long time.
Well,
All
amen,
right.
amen, Dr. Ritter. Pastor Colasar, take us home.
Wow, I don't even know how to follow that. That was so profound. And I think Dr. Ritter started off correct. Like, what are you willing to give up? And it's not my responsibility to go into white congregations and to teach them about a system that was built by whites and Europeans and from which they benefit from as well. So to my white pastors or leaders who are listening right now, you are responsible for reversing slave obey your master theology. And what I mean by that is the same book that was used to create and develop and support racism in America is the book that we need to use to reverse that, because of, we read the book John Wayne and Jesus, and we see that the evangelical churches use the scriptures to promote systemic racism. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that when you stand up and preach, you have to call sin by its rightful name. And I appreciate that Dr. Ritter brought out the point about Jesus. And that means when we call sin by its rightful name, we have to understand that it means naked and I was hungry and you cut welfare. I was thirsty and you gave me brown water to drink in Flint, Michigan. I was in prison and you built more prisons to incarcerate people who look like me, right? And so that is calling sin by its name, and the boldness to be able to stand up and preach that in front of your congregants. And yes, you will lose some folk, but understand that Jesus didn't have a lot of followers because he was calling out the empire. So we have to ask ourselves, are we going to be chaplains of the empire or preachers of resistance? And to our white congregants, that means opening our doors to faith-based groups that fight against injustice. That means sitting in the room and listening to stories of those that have been fatigued and not taking over the program. Sit at the back and learn and listen, and then go to your communities. When you have Thanksgiving and you're sitting around the table, this is not the time to shrink back. This is the moment to teach, to engage, and to reverse what has been taught and promoted for so long, to show that we are all created by one creator and that there needs to be a change immediately. And I would also advise this: take notes from the Truth and Reconciliation Conference from in South Africa and understand what true reconciliation is. That is when the oppressed have an opportunity to tell their story and the oppressor must listen. And then the oppressor gives up power so that equity and equality is therefore manifested. So those are just some things in this brief moment that I would say if I was talking to directly to a white church or to whatever or whomever.
I am full. I am really full. I know that there is another presentation at 11:15. So moderators, please let me know how much time we have. But what I'm taking away is that systemic racism is not an academic term. It's an experience, and real people are being impacted. We're all being impacted. Those who are on the recipient end and those who are inflicting it. But I'm going to leave with, and I'm sorry about that echo. I think Pastor Doc, if you mute yourself. What I'm going to leave with is all of our comments, but what's ingrained on my mind now is that Germany, the same Germany that murdered millions of Jews, is the same Germany that welcomed Syrian refugees decades after. And I know that the Seventh-day Adventist Church, the same Seventh-day Adventist Church, the same Adventist healthcare that denied care to Lucille Byard, is now the same Adventist healthcare that is honoring her legacy with the scholarship to help balance the inequity and to help repair and reconcile. So I leave with hope. We talked about a lot of heavy stuff, but I leave with hope. And I turn it over to you, Pastor Doggett.
Has been a tremendous panel. who has shared a lot of good information with us. And one of our goals is that those who attend this convention and those in local churches would take this information back and use it to make a difference in your local community. So I'm certainly hoping that the systemic racism's unseen wounds will begin to be healed at the local church because of the information you have received and because of your commitment to make a difference right where you are. We are going to have to leave it there because our next service will be with Pastor Dublinaire Snell. But in the interim, you will get some announcements and other things, but we have to leave it here. I want to say thank you to all of our panelists and for their expertise that they shared with us. We look forward to more interactions with all of you. Let's have a word of prayer. Father, as we leave this subject for this time, we ask that you would help us to actually use the information we received to make a positive difference where we are. Let us not just enjoy an event, but help us to be the change that we want to see. Thank you for hearing and answering this prayer. Now bless us as we continue with this great convention. In Jesus' name, amen.